Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the bedroom renovation series on making home better. In part 1 of this series, linked above, we transformed our dated cowboy wallpaper filled room to a modern bedroom for our daughter by stripping the wallpaper, patching the walls, and putting a fresh coat of paint. In this part 2, we will add a modern Cove lighting to the bedroom using LED strips. As always, this was also a learning experience and I made at least one critical mistake. I will go over this more in detail so that you can avoid this simple mistake in your project. So that I can attach the Cove molding, which is made up of 1x3 pine boards, I first marked the studs on the wall. I used a piece of scrap trim to figure out the ideal gap from the ceiling. This was mainly based on the look we were looking for in the bedroom. From this, I made a simple template guide so that I'm not measuring the distance to attach the trim each time. That sounds fancy, but it's really just a 2x4 cut to 4.5 inches. From there, with the help of my daughter, we started attaching them to the studs whenever possible, using a rigid 18-volt cordless brad nailer and 2-inch brad nails. I had never used a brad nailer before and bought one just before this project. Wow, I should have bought this a long time ago. The instant results it gave was great compared to how I have always attached things with screws. For this layer of trim, I tried to keep the brad nails to the middle or higher on the board, since the second layer of trim would go over this and I would not have to patch it later. Wherever two boards met, I cut those using a 45-degree angle. This gave a cleaner finish, especially after the cracks were filled in with the putty and prevented the joints from being misaligned. I did mess up on a couple of the cuts and had joints that butted up against each other without the 45-degree angle, and those worked out okay as well. The bedroom has a small angled wall that required proper angles to be cut to allow two pieces of trim to join properly. Rather than using an angle finder, I used a method to place two trim pieces against the wall to mark the angle. To do this, you just place two trim pieces against the angle on top of each other, mark both sides of the trim that crosses the second piece, connect the two corners, and that will give you the angle to cut the trim for a perfect corner. Once the first layer of trim was up, I moved on to getting the lights. I purchased a 67-foot Cove Smart Wi-Fi LED strip from Amazon. It's linked in the description. This turned out to be a crazy ordeal that required some updates to get everything working. More on this in a little bit. I started by preparing the strip to RGB controller adapter jumper cables. The ends on this needed to be stripped so that it can be connected to an extension cable. This will make more sense in the next step. I wanted to try to hide the wires as much as possible for a clean look. So I poked a hole just above the trim. This will get hidden once the second layer of trim goes up. From there, I made a second hole on the bottom within the same stud cavity. I purchased a 4-wire CL2 rated speaker wire from Amazon and fished that from top to bottom. The LED strip has a connector on the strip itself, so I inserted this new wire in between this connector. I have done some soldering in the past, but very little, and it's not something that I am great at. So I purchased a solder seal wire connector. This has some low temperature solder inside the connector and has essentially a heat shrink sleeve on either end. It has some mixed reviews online, but it worked well for me. To use it, you insert the sleeve onto one side of the wire, you join the two wires together, move the sleeve so that the solder portion is on top of the joint. From there, using a heat gun, you warm up the area, which lets the solder flow into the wires and create a good connection between the wires. With the same heat gun, you can also heat the sleeves, as well creating a watertight seal. I have a Dremel Versatip and this came in handy for this process. Once the wiring portion was complete, I tested out the system and all was good to go. I cleaned the top of the trim to make sure the LED strip will have no issues adhering and proceeded to attaching the strip. For the corners, I just made a small bend that sticks up to avoid cutting the strip. This worked out fine, and the second layer of the trim ended up covering this up so that it was not visible from the room. Installing the LED strip went really smooth. The adhesive backing that came with the strip worked really well and gave a secure connection to the trim. The trouble started just after this when the LED controller that came from Cove started acting strange. For whatever reason, the power button would not turn off the lights from the remote, the switch attached to the controller, or from the Cove app on the phone. Instead of turning off the light, pressing the power button changed the color or mode of the lights. I also noticed that the red color was never visible. This was certainly working when I received the light, but went bad quickly. I reached out to Amazon and Cove directly, and they were both extremely helpful and provided me a replacement right away. Unfortunately, it looked like Cove slightly changed the model, and with this new version, the wires leading to the LED controller is permanently attached to the LED strip. This meant that I would not be able to connect it to the extension wire without cutting the factory wire, which I did not want to do. I was not able to get this resolved with Cove and ended up just purchasing a separate LED controller from Amazon. This is also a Wi-Fi connected device that works with Google Home and Alexa, and I actually have one from the company in another part of my house. This ended up working great and was the final solution. To complete the Cove molding, a second piece of 1x3 trim needed to be installed with an offset from the first layer. So that this offset can be consistent, I put together a quick jig using 2 scrap pieces of trim and some brad nails. From there, it was rinse and repeat of the layer 1 install, cutting 45-degree angles on joins and corners. This install went very quickly with the help of the brad nailer, especially since for this layer, I was not concerned about hitting a stud, since the brad nails are going into the previous layer of trim, which is secured to a stud. With the trim and lighting all installed, it was time to patch all the nail holes and joints to give a clean and professional look before painting. To achieve this, I used Elmer's color changing wood filler. This was very simple to apply by taking a dab on a putty knife or on your finger and applying it to fill the holes. I overfilled slightly so that it can be sanded down smooth. After a quick sanding, it left a very smooth finish for paint. Before painting the trim, I needed to apply a bead of caulk to the bottom of the trim pieces where it joins the wall. The drywall in the room has lots of little imperfections, and this caused lots of gaps between the wall and the trim. This step is where I made a very simple yet costly mistake. I knew I had some caulk from a previous need, so I just picked it up and used it. I only noticed that it was not a paintable caulk until after I completed the entire trim. This caused the painting step to be not perfect. To apply the caulk, I put a piece of blue tape under the trim to allow for a clean line between the caulk and the wall. This worked well and allowed the caulk to not spread over the wall. Because this was not a paintable caulk, I ended up scraping some of the caulk that spread onto the trim pieces to allow for the paint to adhere. If I were to do it again, I would certainly use a paintable caulk, and I will cut the tip of the tube smaller to allow for a smaller bead of caulk to come out. The final step before marking this phase of the project complete was to apply 2 coats of trim paint. I used the same Sherwin-Williams paint from part 1, and with the help of some blue tape, this was completed quick. This was a project that was in planning for a long time. I am extremely satisfied with how everything turned out. It is not a very effortful project, but paying attention to some of the detail, like picking up the right tube of caulking, certainly gives a better end result. Also, having the brad nailer was key, and I can see myself using that for many projects in the future. The bedroom is coming along good, and if you have not watched the first part of the transformation, be sure to check that out. I will link to this at the end of this video. Please also subscribe to stay up to date on the upcoming parts of this series and many other projects. Thank you very much for spending your time checking this out, and I hope you found it helpful. Until next time, take care.